Chapter 15. No more half measures. It was long past the end of my shift when I was finally able to return to my home and family that day in the market, before the sun had set on the event in which Graham spared the waster who started the almost market-wide brawl. The elders, temple leadership, constable, and all the lieutenants of the guard were aware of the situation. It wasn't until word spread about what happened with Graham in particular, and my arrival with him in chains, that brought the community within the walls to a halt. After being told to place Joshua Graham in a cell by the barracks, the metal and concrete insulated 15 by 15 foot box next to Cade's, I was immediately sent to a small series of meetings with the constable. One by one, every guardsman who was there for the first riot around the charity stalls was brought in following their replacement, by reserves from the night guard who were sent to fill in. Then, every guardsman who witnessed the brawl and incident with Graham was brought before the constable to give their interviews and statements about what happened. I was one of the first to meet with the constable beside Lieutenant Camden for that first meeting regarding the initial riot. After that short interview where I didn't have much to say, I was waiting outside on a chair while each guardsman was called into the constable's office on the top floor of the barracks to be interviewed. The officers on patrol and the officers in charge of the overlooking tower detachments were told to stand by after the first interview, and something stuck with me as more and more guardsmen came in for the second interview. As it may have become known, the constable was not an angry or bad-tempered man. The man almost never raised his voice at anyone other than to perhaps call attention to someone from a distance, or to give orders over the crack of gunfire, and this event was met with such calm I didn't know what to make of it. As I sat outside his office following that first meeting, I thought back to the moments immediately after showing up before the constable with Graham in a pair of shackles. By that time, the constable was already aware of the violence in the market, but the sight of Graham did little other than make the friendly constable's business-like emotion on his face even more sullen. My interview about the first event was short, most likely because I wasn't there to watch how it started, but even the interviews of the other lieutenants and guardsmen were short as well. Recalling his change in demeanor, I found this somewhat puzzling, and although I had no reason to believe the constable's anger or frustration would be heard through the door, part of me believed this would be one of those few occasions once Graham was in a cell. Part of me feared this even more when the first ones were called in for interviews about the second event. Yet there was nothing to be heard through the closed and locked door, as one person went in after another. I didn't know what the temperature of the constable's office would be before the second interview, but after the first guardsman came out, the young man did so with a smile across his dusty and bruised face. The man's part in the quelling of the violence before Graham's vicious sermon showed very noticeably on his face, yet it did not distract from the smile etched into it by his mouth. That smile seemed to somehow say it all, and as each guardsman was called before the constable for their second interview, those men waiting outside subtly became more audible about their view of Graham's actions. The low conversations throughout the small room full of occupied chairs turned into casual chatting, then laughing as more men came out of the constable's office smiling about something. Me and the other officers present for the incident were silent, more focused on composure than the lower guards who began to engage enthusiastically with one another about the events as more of their friends came out. It took me a while after the whispers turned into full-on conversations to take in what was being said, but then I did, and the reaction from the other men who protected our community became intelligible. While I was still completely confused and lost in regard to what I thought of the event, the battered and bruised men of the lower guard were nearly ecstatic about it. They loved what happened in the market, they loved what happened to the waster, and their admiration for what happened only increased in volume as more men exited the constable's office with smiles on their faces. I began wondering anxiously what this interview with the constable was going to entail, but I was apparently alone in this as the lieutenants beside me began to whisper and chuckle about the event themselves. Based on the smiles of everyone who left the office, I started to believe that the constable was giving them all private celebrations about the event. But then I again remembered what the constable's face looked like as I relayed my experience of the first riot in that first interview. There was no way that Constable Hanshaw, who sat across from me with a face of stone-cold contemplation and severity, was happy about what he was having to do in the wake of such an incident. There must have been some other reason for the smiles that left that office. But I couldn't fathom that reason until it gradually began to make a little more sense with each conversation I overheard happening around me. Looking around, everyone on the top floor waiting for their turn with the constable was telling one another where they were in a brawl, which waster they dealt with, and how they dealt with them. I caught bits of conversation, here and there, guards pointing out their friends who were with them, and some went on quoting what Graham had said, as if to act out the scene again. Between the laughing and the joking and the recitations, and so much enthusiasm about the scene in the market, I began to realize that the men's smiles after the meeting had nothing to do with the constable or how the interview went. What they saw Graham do only an hour and a half earlier could not be swayed by anything, even if the constable did turn into a ravenous beast when the door to the office was locked behind them. Personally, I still did not know what to make or think of the whole thing. I couldn't quite figure out why the guardsmen and even some of my fellow lieutenants at this point were taking the whole thing the way they were. I could only think about the face of that waster, so broken and disfigured, and so incredibly terrified underneath all that blood. I thought of those screams and the sound of that man crying as the burned man held his head up and pressed a pistol to it. Even memory of the scene nearly made me shudder, as I felt a cocktail of emotions, from sympathy to shame to horror to admiration, to worry about what was to come of the event. The lieutenant on my right was called into the office, and I heard more of what the guardsmen were saying. With a mind totally focused on the pitiful sight of that waster's horror-stricken face, as the burned man lorded over him, I stood myself up, unsure of what I was going to say, if anything. The loudest part of me felt like screaming. "How can you laugh about this? That man was a human being." However, as soon as I stood, and before my tongue could speak, Nathan and John had taken notice of me from their chairs across the little open room and shouted at me with faces brightened by cheer and an enthusiasm I hadn't ever seen before. "Hey, Lieutenant Young!" exclaimed Nathan, holding his wrapped arm in a sling, and adding, "Where's Graham now?" I froze, forgetting what I was going to say as the eyes of everyone in the room were upon me. Conversations between guards throughout the room were lowered to whispers, as they all looked at me with their eyes open wide and beaming. It was here that I just then realized something that eluded me while I was lost in my own thoughts. I studied each face, lining the edge of that room, all the way to those sitting against the railing down to the second level. There I noticed every single guard in the room sat in their place with a bright, smiling face, and each one of them bore some kind of splint or bleeding wrap somewhere on their bodies or heads. Some of them were like Nathan, holding a bandage-wrapped arm in a slings. Some had a uniform pant leg rolled up, exposing a dirty wrapping around one or both legs. Some had their shoulders wrapped with the dried blood peeking out from underneath the hasty wrapping. Some had one or both hands bound in the same tattered wrapping, while one man was shirtless with the same wrapping around the entire center of his chest. This realization made me freeze and forget what I wanted to say even more, as I came to understand a bit more of the reason for those smiles on the faces of each man who left the constable with their account of the second riot. Looking around the room and seeing all those bloody and bruised men smiling at me standing before them all, it came to me clear as day as the words I heard in waiting rang in my mind. These men wearing the same wrappings around their wounds as Graham were the image bearers of Graham. They didn't just admire what Graham did to that waster in the market, they adored him for it. Upon discovering this, I was still at a loss with even more to think about. Although it may have only been a few short moments since I stood, I was still trying to figure out why I stood and what I stood for when one of the men, a young man under Lieutenant Camden, asked from somewhere on my right, "They tell you to put him in a cell, LT." I kept looking at my men, seeing John with a blood-speckled bandage around his head kept in place by his cap, and his face wearing the largest smile I'd ever seen on him. Before I could refocus and answer Nathan's question, or the guard who just spoke, another one said jovially, "Hey Schroyer, you still got the crowbar? I'm up for busting him out. You in too, Lieutenant Young." Everyone laughed, and the entire room exploded with a joy unlike before. The lieutenants beside me laughed. Nathan, John, Carl, and Ramos laughed, even leaning on the shoulders of the boys in Mitchell's detachment to keep themselves upright. I stood in place as the laughter continued, and remembered the face of that waster and my prior rage at the guardsmen's attitudes just for a second. More jokes were spoken aloud about breaking Graham's cell open, and just when I was about to shout my contempt for what I kept hearing, I remembered the sound of Graham's screams as he was beaten so savagely over a pail full of water he would have given to the wasters anyway. If only they'd asked first. I heard those cries of Graham's pain as he was beaten into the ground. Those cries echoed in my mind 1,000,000 times in the 5 seconds after the last question, and the image of all the men around me wrapped and bleeding struck me again as I finally replied, "Let's just see what the constable has to say first." This caused another uproar of laughter amongst the guards and lieutenants in the room as everyone returned to their own conversations with one another. In those words I spoke, I realized I was one of them too. I didn't wear the wrappings of my men or those of Graham, but I discovered that I too had no true pity for the waster when the screams of Graham's pain echoed in my mind. Only a moment later, and before I could sit back down and resume distantly contemplating what was already done, Lieutenant Pryor exited the office with a smile on his face and a wrapping around his shoulders, saying, "You're up, young." The second interview with the constable was much longer this time. I relayed everything that happened down to the letter, what was said, what was done, who was there, and where the waster Graham spared most likely ended up. The entire time I spoke, the constable's face remained unchanged from the one I saw in the first interview. Not angry, not sad, not concerned, not anything beyond stern contemplation. As I finished up my testimony of what happened, the constable said, "Hold that thought, Paul." He turned from me and adjusted something on the radio atop his desk, apparently turning the knobs to tune it as a faint static began to whir beyond the muffled laughter heard outside the office. After a moment, he lifted the receiver I hadn't seen from its place behind the bulky radio set and spoke into it. "Did you catch that, Mr. Albright?" I wondered if the interviews were being recorded at the mention of one of the temple elders' names. Just then, the other end spoke, understood. "Thank you, Mr. Hanshaw," said the static voice of Elder Albright. "Mr. Harlan? Bishop Mordecai?" asked the constable, as I wondered if all the elders were hearing this directly. Not to mention my surprise at the mention of the bishop himself being on the other end when he was most likely at home during this time in the late afternoon. The 2 elders and bishop did catch all I had said, and although I didn't doubt that we were being recorded for future discussion, I didn't know that they or the bishop themselves were listening in directly. Still, it was only the 2 elders and bishop who were hearing this, and before I could think about anything else, the constable looked back up at me and said coolly, "Sorry about that. Go on, Paul." A brief silence ensued as I switched gears and replied simply, "No problem, Constable. I was done anyway." At that, his eyes lingered on me a moment longer, still without any change in his expression as he looked back down at the receiver with the words, "Anything else, elders? Bishop?" The radio stayed silent for a moment, presumably as the elders and bishop talked to one another on a different frequency until the bishop himself spoke for me and the constable. "That should be enough for now, gentlemen. Have the lieutenants stand by and dismiss the rest of the guardsmen back to their duties or to have their wounds tended to. That's all we need to hear." The constable dismissed me to relay the order, and I stepped out. As the guards of the detachments involved dismissed back down the stairs, me and the other 3 lieutenants there for the second riot stood by. The laughter and loud conversation of our men fading into the distance as our men departed back downstairs. Once our men were gone, the lieutenants turned around, and the constable was already walking towards the stairs, making us follow with the words, "Follow me." The constable led us to the meeting room with the wide windows above the museum and archives building, overlooking the town square across from the temple, and there all the elders were assembled. Some of the elderly men of the temple were entering almost as we were, dressed in their casual attire. Upon taking our places across from the temple leadership, the first of a series of meetings began. I'll keep the whole thing short by saying that after the other elders had been caught up on what happened in the market only a couple of hours earlier, an argument began. Most of us defenders of the community were silent, as the argument was for the large part amongst the temple officials. The elders turned to us when necessary and for clarification on certain aspects being discussed. But for the most part, the arguing was largely about whether or not Graham acted justly. It eventually turned into disputes about whether or not Graham was at fault in the first place, and the majority was glad he was sitting in the cell. After coming to this conclusion, the meeting was adjourned, and I returned home around an hour and a half after I would have normally gotten off. At home, I caught my wife up on what kept me for so long, and the decision was made to not discuss it amongst ourselves, and certainly not our children. Hearing Michelle, Hannah, and even Joe talk about the rumors they heard about the event, the wife and I dismissed them as just that, and the next morning came. With the arrival of the next morning, I wasn't at my station in the East Tower for more than an hour and a half before one of Hanshaw's runners stepped up to the top saying for me, John, and Carl to follow him. Again, I entered the meeting room above the archives, leaving my men with those of the other lieutenants to talk in the waiting room outside as we entered at the request of the constable. Once again, we took our seats across from the elders, now all dressed in their white and black robes, when this second meeting commenced. By this second meeting, all the elders were aware of what was said in the numerous recorded interviews with the constable, hence the request for certain lower guardsmen who waited outside. With all the elders aware of the situation, the second meeting began with a renewed argument about whether or not the actions of Graham were justified. It was no longer the case that they were at the same conclusion. No longer were the elders all glad for his confinement to a cell, but the majority were unchanged, leading to the men outside to come in one by one and stand before the leaders of the community to account for what was said in the interview. Although I was pretty glad Nathan wasn't asked to give his testimony, I still wasn't sure how I felt about John's. I could have easily mistaken the testimony of John for that of Nathan, who I assumed would have been overly enthusiastic and inappropriately happy about what Graham had done. After becoming a little more ashamed of John, my second, I realized I didn't want to be a hypocrite, for I was still one who shared the general sentiment of the lower guard, even if I could conceal my true feelings more professionally than John or Nathan. The meeting went on, and a shameful theme was soon articulated after even the first guardsman stood to give his testimony. The guard was glad about what happened. This much was well known by the elders during this meeting, and numerous condemnations were sent towards we officers about the discipline and demeanor of our men. All the while, the constable remained silent, twisting his mustache in contemplation and taking the lectures just like me and my fellow lieutenants of the guard. After the lower guards outside were dismissed, the men across the table still argued, but the argument turned towards how long to keep Graham confined to his cell and whether or not to exile him. The meeting was soon adjourned, and the constable led us lieutenants out of the room with the quiet order to return to our stations, as his face showed visible agitation. Later on in the day, as the men and I stood atop the towers still speaking their admiration for Graham aloud, I remained silent on the matter, taking note of the strange new spirit I'd seen in them. Shortly after 2 p.m., the constable arrived atop our tower, greeted the men as cheerily as he could with a mind focused on other matters, and the guards took the arrival of the constable to display an extra vigilant watch on the market. It became clear where the attention of the guards were focused when I saw their heads all turned toward the open area where that well stood. The traffic of the day, and even the charity stalls, were still handing out provisions to the masses of refugees, this time with more guards standing by, and I turned to the silent constable sitting on my chair next to the table with the radio set. Seeing his face locked in stern contemplation, I asked him plainly, "What do you think should be done with Graham?" There was no visible reaction on his face, or shift in his eyes, but I did catch the ears of my men prick upward out of the corner of my eye, as he said in a resigned but an entirely certain way. The elders like to argue, and sometimes feel more free of sin than others, but I want what they'll end up doing. Part of me knew what he was talking about, but I couldn't articulate it either if I was asked to do so. Then he said, "Just wish we didn't have to go through the whole show." I wasn't entirely sure what he was referring to, but I would later. Not long before the close of our shift, the constable's runner called me to the meeting room again, this time without any of my men, and the third meeting began. Although the elders had turned away from their conclusion to exile Graham, the argument about what they heard in the interviews continued. More lectures about the attitudes of our guards were occasionally sent towards we officers sitting across from the temple leadership. There was still plenty who condemned the actions of our men to quell the riot, as well as the actions of Graham. Strangely enough, however, it was sometimes those elders who said things like, "We are not a community of barbarians," and "Where was grace shown in ranks of our guardsmen during the savage beating of the wasters?" were sometimes the very same ones who said, "The guards need to defend themselves, and Graham was the victim here." It was when I heard these statements that the words of the constable began to make a bit more sense. Just wish we didn't have to go through the whole show. That's what this was. It was all a theological discussion. These men, our community's elders, knew the truth and probably knew what their conclusion would, probably after that first meeting. Talk of exile, talk of condemnation, and talk of what should have been done was just that. Talk. I'm not against tackling issues from many angles, but no matter the dilemma or situation like the one with Graham, the answer could all be found in the book our community reads and tells the world about. In particular, the answer could be found if one reads the parable of the prodigal son and knows what the father did for the son. In that story, the father welcomed the son into his home anyway. By the end of this meeting, it came to a close and they arrived at their newest conclusion. Graham had a right to defend himself, but the degree to which he did so should be condemned, not celebrated. That was more or less where I had landed on the whole thing after the dust had settled, even if my subconscious already did in the moments after the fight. After all the lectures, throughout that third meeting, I remembered the broken face of that wastelander, the horrible sounds of his sobbing, and the sounds Graham made when he too was broken from the beating of so many men. I arrived at home probably an hour after I was supposed to get off, and the night with my family went much like the previous one before the next morning arrived. A knock at the door said I was to immediately head to the meeting room after the morning muster. Once again, me, the other lieutenants involved, and the constable sat before the elders. This fourth meeting was unlike the other ones. No longer did the elders argue about whether Graham was right. No longer were U.S. members of the Guard lectured about what we failed to do to de-escalate the situation. No longer were they discussing the fate of Graham. I don't know what was said when we left, or what was talked about over the elders' Tuesday dinner last night. Instead, the meeting started with a simple question. Bishop Mordecai, who'd been largely quiet in the past 3 meetings while his elders argued, started this meeting with a question directed at the constable while his eyes were on me. How long until this gets out? There was mention of the outlaw Doyle and I brought in over 2 weeks back, and the discussion was locked onto the topic of who was there in the fight. How many onlookers? How many fighters? What were people saying? Etc. I was called upon and reiterated what was said in my interview, how it seemed like the violent wastelanders started the fight by apparently trying to steal water from someone they thought was a ghoul. It was in this meeting that I revealed I hadn't heard anything else in the market. No new stories about the ex-legate, and no new whispers about who it was that stood over the wastelander with a leveled gun and explosive words about the brutal mercy he attributed to Christ. All was silent outside, but the incident was still, from everyone I'd talked to since the event, known to all. I thought of all the caravanners and traders who come and go from our markets each day, how many travelers who saw that happen only to leave and continue their journeys that night. And the elders must have considered this as well. All the elders' previous intentions to exile Graham were forgotten in an instant, and despite a few more lectures coming our way about the Guard's demeanor, there was something they refused to tell us directly that made the elders leap to the final suggestion of Elder Larsdale. We need to close up his house outside the walls. The bishop suggested that Graham be released from the cell, and have any wounds immediately tended to if they hadn't been already. The particulars of Graham's decided fate were unknown to me after the guards were dismissed, but the constable was told to hang back, and we lieutenants were told to wait for him outside. Approximately 30 minutes passed in the waiting area by the staircase to the museum level, and us lieutenants remained largely quiet. We talked lowly to pass the time, but our minds were still on everything from the fate of Graham, to the incident that took 4 meetings, to which detachments we would have doing what on this coming day and that. We weren't waiting for more than 35 minutes before the constable stepped through the double doors, dismissed the others, and caught me by the shoulder, asking, "Do you and Daniela have groceries and room for a guest?" The face of the constable was no longer sullen as it had been the past 2 days. Now it was calm, and the faintest hint of his normal smile was on his face as mine turned to confusion by the question. "It should only be a few days while quarters are arranged, and the elders will compensate you for the expense." It was decided. The incident in the market, where Joshua Graham expressed his love of our Lord through a hail of bullets, was where the elders, the Guard, and the community of New Canaan as a whole decided that we could no more attempt to simply forget about his return to our home. No more could we let him live an unknown, incognito existence just outside the community. With the options of turning him loose, or fully embrace him as one of our own within the walls, the elders begrudgingly decided that there could be no more half measures in regard to the nature of Joshua Graham. The matter would stay quiet amongst the community, but little by little people would understand what was done, whether it was by word of mouth, or by seeing him walk the cobbled streets within the safety of the walls. Joshua Graham was a secret we could no longer leave outside. He was one of us. We had decided that during the night in the temple, and it was now time to act upon the next step of what was started. Graham's presence within the walls would remain somewhat controversial in the days, weeks, and eventual months following this decision. The elders didn't make their decision out of love for what he did, but more out of necessity and commitment to the path they originally started down when I brought him into the temple the night after his return to our home. Not all would like his presence, as word of him outside the walls remained unspoken by Guard and New Canaanite alike, but he had those who loved what he showed he stood for, and I stood uncertain, at least outwardly. I still didn't like what he did to the waster he held in his grip, but I understood it. I understood the pain he endured at the hands of those who simply wouldn't leave him be, and I knew what kind of men there were out there beyond the walls, and even those who would come to our gates despite the authority of our guardsmen. Even if I couldn't outwardly show my agreement with what he'd done, I was at least inwardly at peace about the event. Although I did not walk away from the market wearing the bandages like the men of the lower guard or those of Graham's identity, I knew the world out there was brutal, and sometimes it needed to be met with a similar brutality. However, even then, there was still a place for God's mercy. In the meantime, I agreed to shelter Mr. Graham, while the rest of the temple's leadership figured out what his place in our community would look like, and where he would live. I only wished this new arrangement didn't fall on the same day I offered to host dinner for the community, an elder's beloved career missionary, Daniel. Chapter 16, Communion with Friends, Part 1. 2 days after the incident in the market, a selected group of guards were sent to release Graham from the small cell behind the barracks next to the outlaw Tom Cades, while I was allowed to go home and let my wife know about the guest we were about to offer lodgings. The constable said they would probably begin packing up Graham's possessions from his shack outside the wall before they released him, so I had some extra time as well. Unfortunately, I remembered to ask Danny if she was able to make an extra few portions for Mr. Mathers, Daniel the missionary, and anyone else who might tag along before I mentioned the guest situation. I don't believe I intentionally left out the name of our guest, but Daniela almost didn't mind when I mentioned having Daniel and Mr. Mathers over for dinner. She was friends with and occasionally did some work with the people of missions coordination, and we'd had Daniel over for dinner several times in the past. She only asked if it was Daniel who would be staying with us, and I didn't have to say anything further as she immediately took on the assumption and expressed how his presence in the house would do wonders for Hannah and Joseph's enthusiasm about their studies. I decided not to correct her and say who our guest would really be. I didn't know what her reaction would be, so I decided to surprise her as well as myself. I departed, and she said this was the perfect day to do those Brahmin steaks and smoked vegetables she got in bulk with the last shipment from the folks of Jude. It was only the late morning, and the kids were still at school, but the news of a guest staying with us and a nice dinner with friends had her immediately begin a thorough house cleaning, while she set out the guest bedding on the couch and tried to get as much done as possible before getting an early start on dinner. She was happy to hear that I wouldn't be held late again by meetings, and was so excited to have friends over that she didn't even ask about the meeting's conclusions, or ask for a reminder on what those meetings were even about. It warmed my heart to see my wife in such a jovial manner before I left, and although she was kept busy almost every day with garden tending, cleaning, preparing meals, sewing for half the neighborhood, laundry, women's groups, volunteering at numerous trades across town, picking up the kids, tutoring the kids, fetching the water, and so much more, she rarely had the opportunity to host friends for something as relaxing as a casual dinner. Walking toward the other end of town, I passed one of the constable's runners on my way to Graham's cell who said the guys clearing Graham's place could use an extra set of hands. I exited the gates into the market and passed my men who stood by our normal station beneath the East Tower. I caught my men up briefly on what was happening and decided not to tell them who I was hosting as they were still evidently lively about this event of the day and that one. not to mention their lingering enthusiasm about the notable event of days previously. They only asked me if this morning's most recent meeting was the final one. I told them I thought it was, and the boys remained duty-bound to keep their enthusiasm in check, as they asked what was to come of the prisoner. I didn't answer that. Time would tell them. And perhaps they'd be able to put two and two together when I re-entered the community with Graham's possessions in hand. Meeting up with the crew in charge of moving Graham's possessions inside the community, I was surprised to see that me and the other 6 guardsmen could get it all in one go. The shack looked unchanged from the one I entered to overhear the words of Miss Neal. The burned man had scarcely a single thing to his name, save for the items in those gift baskets and buckets that were left for his bedside upon arrival at Dr. Franklin's clinic. Of course, most of those baskets were lighter, and there was one full of wrappers of food items, but how he managed to make even these last for over 2 weeks was unknown. There it strangely occurred to me that there would have been one more gifted pail, if it hadn't played a crucial part in Graham's new living arrangements. Once all was collected up, me and the other men headed for the gate and went back inside as the guards of my detachment and the ones of the station opposite them were staring at what we had in hands. I told the crew to make for my house and leave the buckets beside the gate of my front yard or by the porch, and they departed while I made my way to the barracks and cells behind them. Although it may not be necessary, I'll explain that the cells behind the barracks were not some large sector of the town. The cells were not part of any prison, but merely a collection of 8 identical 12 by 12 foot concrete and metal structures along the east wall of our community's home. At the time of this event, I believe only 4 of the cells were inhabited, one by Tom Cade, one by Joshua Graham, and I don't remember who inhabited the others. The cells were small and looked rather ominous from the outside, but all had 2 small barred windows along the top of the front and rear sides, and each connected to the same air conditioning and heating unit. It wasn't often that we dealt with criminals from the outside or even inside the community, so the cells were almost never at capacity, but each one had a single set of bunk beds, a cushioned chair, a locker for clothes, a nightstand beside the bed, a toilet and sink connected to the nearby cisterns for this part of town. Despite the 2 Bibles atop the nightstands, there wasn't anything else in any of the cells, so they weren't the most horrible things in the world by the standards of almost any other community in the wastelands. Still, the cells were more of a locker room, or a place to rest between interviews with those in charge of their case, or a place to sleep when the prisoner wasn't working off their sentence in the community's servitude program. I only mentioned the above in order to give an adequate picture of what happened when I motioned towards the guardsman outside the cell marked 7, and he let me in. Graham sat upright atop the lower bunk, while the constable sat coolly and reclined in the armchair across from him. The 2 had scarcely noticed my arrival beyond the glances from both men as the door creaked open. Evidently, the 2 were engaged in a long discussion before my entrance, and although I didn't catch much more than the concluding words, I figured the constable was explaining what was decided in all those meetings. As the 2 concluded their talk, I stood silently by, noticing the constable's face was still easing back to its normal cheery self after the gloom of the past 2 days of meetings. There I noticed Graham was more or less back to himself too, what little I knew of his casual self. Graham sat like a statue in what appeared to be that same pair of dusty and ripped light blue jeans, and if he still suffered from the beating of those wasters, it wasn't shown as he wore a fresh set of bandages over his entire body and hid beneath a new loose white-collared shirt. After maybe a minute, the 2 turned their heads to me for a second, stood up, and the constable shook the burned man's hand as the latter let out a slight groan with the constable's cheery word, "Agreed." Turning to me, the constable walked past me and touched my shoulder, saying, "You got it from here, Paul?" I nodded. He slapped my shoulder and exited with the words, "The temple, and I will keep you updated." Before taking my exit as well, the burned man stepped up to me. I shook his hand with a mind blank, as he said in that deep, stern, and pained voice,
"Lead the way, Lieutenant Young."
Beyond the initial introductions, and beyond what I was perhaps expecting at his arrival, my wife greeted the burned man warmly, and even embraced him after asking if it would be too painful to do so. The man said he didn't mind, and after the introduction and short friendly banter, it was clear she had a lot of work to do before the kids got home and before dinner. The only thing I noticed, even in the short introductory talk, was her frequent glances at me that seemed to say something like, "You could have told me so I'd be ready." Still though, she took it well, and even though she was too busy to help when he and I moved his buckets of possessions inside, she truly seemed to have no issue with the whole thing, even when I said I wasn't sure how long the constable would need him to stay with us, and even if those frequent glances continued well into dinner. When dinner was served, my wife sat opposite from me at the other head of the table that night, enthusiastically engaging in the conversations with Daniel and Mr. Mathers, while still silently darting her eyes almost worriedly from the wrapped man on her immediate right to me, just before asking him kindly, something along the lines of, "Would you like some more water, Mr. Graham?" The man would painfully choke down some of his dinner, stifling a scream from his scorched throat. The room would go silent, my wife's eyes would dart to me, and then everything would return to normal after he replied something like,
"No thank you, ma'am. I appreciate the offer, though."
It was like that almost all afternoon. My wife was friendly, but simply didn't have anything to say to the wrapped man beyond the kind of offers she'd extend to anyone we had over for a visit. She let him help when he asked to help her with something in the kitchen or asked to help her do a chore. She was also friendly, but a few words when he commented on something she and I were discussing in his polite way. But frankly, she never started any discussion or conversation with him. I couldn't tell if this understandable distance was because of the amount she had to do, if she was still frightened by him, or if it was a combination of those two things and probably others. But as I said, the lack of conversing between the two was easily understandable. What would a busy housewife even have to say to a man she'd only ever heard about in nightmare stories of war, slaughter, slavery, and most recently, a miraculous return to Christ after finding him again in a ball of fire? Christ has a way of unifying even the most different of people, but a distance remained. She wasn't the only one to feel this way, and there will be more to say about that unity later. For the most part, Graham stayed silent, especially when the children arrived later that afternoon, and then when Daniel and Mr. Mathers showed up. After the arrival of the others, and after the awkwardness about seeing who was joining the evening, Graham began to take on the presence of something like an interesting antique chair. As opposed to a man, it'll catch your eye pretty frequently, but you aren't really going to go out of your way to chat with it unless you're crazy. What I can say about everyone's reactions and attitudes towards such a guest could probably only really be shown well if I recount the dinner. This is especially since I believe the dinner and all the temperaments of the attendees captured what was in the minds of just about everyone in New Canaan after learning that Joshua Graham was formally here to stay and inside the walls. My son and youngest child sat across from Mr. Graham by his mom, and he couldn't turn his eyes away from the bandaged man, almost forgetting to eat. Joseph was too focused on trying to catch a glimpse of the burned man's true form every time the bandages on his face were lowered for a bite. Hannah sat beside me on my right, keeping one eye on Graham and one on the comic book beneath the table, needing a reminder every now and then to finish her plate. I only allowed the comic book at the table when the conversations between the adults became more adult-oriented. Michelle sat beside me on my left, actively engaged in the stories and topics of Daniel and Mr. Mathers. She became particularly involved when Daniel started telling about his work on the various missions he'd undergone in the past year. Her first mission was still a few months away, but it was coming up, and her excitement was growing by the day, so she had all sorts of things to ask Daniel about. As this topic went on, she'd all but forgotten about the man on the other end of the table she was previously diverting half her focus towards. Many times she'd glance towards me with a raised eyebrow, usually whenever Mr. Graham began that subtle choking sound, seeming to ask mentally if he was all right. Throughout dinner, Mr. Mathers was frequently going between actively involved in the conversations and merriment to short moments of staring at Graham beside him, mouth agape, and seemingly ready to spill out a million questions he was keeping inside. Both Daniel and Mr. Mathers were the prime sources of conversation throughout dinner. The two men of the temple sect held very different roles in the community, but were very good at casual discourse, and had personalities that made them very good with the kids. Mr. Mathers would talk to Joseph and Hannah about their studies, and always eager to talk to other grown-ups. Joseph in particular would answer each question enthusiastically, almost hopping up and down in his seat before his eyes would go back to Graham. As I already said, Michelle was more than happy to have the two men over. and since she was almost a community, certified adult herself, joined in the laughing and interesting stories of the two men like a true socialite. I answered questions that came my way and had lots to say to the two about this and that, refraining from certain topics since there were children at the table, but I likely wasn't as engaged as I normally would have been if we didn't have the wrapped man sitting silently by my wife and occasionally stifling the pain of simply eating. I think all of us knew everyone else's minds weren't completely involved like they would have been, but nobody dared to say anything to Graham. As I said about my wife, I think was true for us all, there just wasn't much to say. And so, the evening was a blast. A dinner with men like Daniel and Mr. Mathers was always a delight to the entire family. The kids were having fun, Danny and I were having fun, and everything was wonderful as we all did a superb job at not talking about that enormous elephant in the room. Although I've only seen pictures of elephants once or twice in my life amongst the pages of barely legible pre-war books, I never quite understood that expression until there was one at my dinner table while I was with my family and friends. As I may have alluded to, Daniel was the primary source of topics and conversations for the evening, going on and answering questions from Mr. Mathers and all of my family members about the missions. It was because of this liveliness in the spirit of my longtime friend of the Missions Corps that it was only him who seemingly hadn't even noticed Graham at all after the initial introductions. Just as I said above, everyone at the table appeared to have one eye on their food or who was talking and another on Mr. Graham, but Daniel seemed almost unaffected as we all laughed and shared and talked. Despite this fact, it was Daniel himself who first extended an invitation for my bandage-wrapped house guest to join the conversation. It just wasn't done in a way that I, or perhaps even he would have done had he known better. My eyes were going to Graham rather frequently as Daniel spoke. The missionary was talking to Michelle and all of us about his later work with the Sorrows tribe of Zion, and that naturally led to a topic he mentioned to Mr. Mathers and I briefly at the inn before I was called away to witness the event in the market. Daniel said to Michelle, who'd asked the most recent question, "Dead horses, that's who's been attacking the Sorrows every couple months or so. Them and the children of the canyon, but they aren't too bad when they attack." "That's awful," said Michelle with genuine sadness and fright in her voice. "The Sorrows are so kind and sweet. I was talking to Josie, and the fact a tribe like the Dead Horses would try to raid a people like them just breaks my heart." Daniel said to everyone with a smile, "The Sorrows have been one of, if not my most favorite tribe to work with in recent memory. Josie was right though, and I can tell you firsthand that she showed a kind of bravery I admittedly hadn't thought her capable of during some of the more..." He paused in search of the right word before saying, "frightening attacks." "Josie said it's her mama bear instinct," said Michelle, causing everyone at the table to chuckle or smile. She wasn't kidding. Josie and her work with the kids of that tribe was beyond commendable. I hope the next one to visit the Sorrows picks up where she left off with them. "Hopefully that will be me," said my eldest daughter. "I told her I would love nothing more than to continue that program with the kids. I just pray Mr. Oakley will approve my request after Elder Rockwell has a chance to see it." Daniel must have taken special note of the longing sound in her voice because he finished swallowing the bite he took and said to her with a look of assurance, "I can have a talk with both of them and see what I can do to help make that happen. Michelle." Almost immediately, my daughter's face lit up as she said, "Thank you so much, Daniel. I can't tell you how much I appreciate that." Daniel nodded, and Michelle added, "Hopefully the dead horses start to leave them alone by then as well." I mentally said that I would be praying that as well, and Daniel's tone became serious as the delight of making her happy cooled. "Just be careful when you get there, and know that the valley beyond the Narrows is still dangerous. The Zion Valley itself is not as bad as other places in the wilderness, and even if the dead horses' attacks are few and far between, a raid by a tribe like them is a very serious matter. They've been trained by the worst of them." Daniel immediately stopped what he was going to say, even if he'd already said it. His eyes remained on Michelle, but the eyes of everyone remained on Daniel, as Michelle asked what everyone except me and Mr. Mathers and Mr. Graham were thinking. "Trained? War tribes get trainers? Ha." The laugh on the end died into silence. Although the second of silence was no more than just that, I swore that I saw the eyes of Daniel go straight to the answer to Michelle's question for only a fraction of a millisecond. Nobody else caught it, aside from maybe Mr. Mathers, while Mr. Graham sat there like the statue he was so good at being. Daniel lowered the glass of water from his lips and said to Michelle, "I just mean—" He lowered the glass further, mentally selecting what words he should say and what those words would mean, to who, as he finally said to the mission-eager young woman, "Some tribes like picking on their neighbors, and sometimes those tribes reach out to ones who are the best at that for assistance." The pause, this time again, might not have been more than a second, but it was here he admitted it with courtesy, for all guests at my table. Tribes like the Legion. Sometimes it's even the Legion's best who train the tribes. Graham had not moved one bit. He remained unchanged from his prior position. His plate sat clean, and his back straight, almost as if waiting to be excused. At Daniel's explanation, Michelle just said, "Oh, okay," appearing completely oblivious to the fact that one of the Legion's best, the man who personally trained the dead horses to raid tribes like the Sorrows, was right at the very table she sat at, and one chair past Mr. Mathers. Either she was oblivious, or she put the pieces together and refused to acknowledge further out of courtesy, but either way, the conversation took a different turn. Mr. Mathers went on about his work at the ranch outside of town, and I felt the conclusion of the dead horses topic was the moment something changed in Daniel. It wasn't truly observable, but I think the talk about the dead horses and Mr. Graham's statue-like reaction showed Daniel that even though he might not have the ability to talk about Graham directly, he could perhaps get away with alluding to Graham. Maybe he thought he could get away with similar statements more and more, since it was known by everyone almost at the very start of the evening that he'd been away from New Canaan for nearly a full year without return. Being the man who's been away, it was understandable that he wanted to get caught up on things, at home, and even though he knew much, he had only been back for 2 days at this point, and he already knew that his outsider view was the source of much of the evening's joy. A man who'd been out and seen the world might be able to give a fresh set of eyes on topics of recent days, like the day of his return from mission, and the events he hadn't gotten to witness himself from inside the Trinity Inn. This must have led Daniel to eventually say, "It appears there's a lot of unrest here at home these days. I'm saddened to hear about what happened in the market the day of my arrival. Mr. Mathers, my wife, and I felt a strange uneasiness as we 3 said almost simultaneously, 'Truly unfortunate.' I don't think I was the only one to say that, with an allusion to the fact the topic should be left at that." Daniel seemingly didn't take the hint and went right along. "It truly is a sad time when something like a near riot could happen in the middle of broad daylight." His words felt all right for me, supposing he was talking about the first incident where the refugees were turned violent by wasters in the mob, demanding free things at a charitable event. But then Daniel clarified what and who he was referring to. "Mercy is a hard thing to offer in such a situation, and I know you and the guard did all you could, Paul." Glancing at me as he said my name, he resumed, "Still though, I heard one poor fool is still in Dr. Franklin's clinic outside the walls. The man has no ears anymore, almost no more teeth, and I hear he suffered such blows to the head that Dr. Franklin and her staff expect him to stay in an infantile state for the rest of his life." I felt my face heat up slightly, remembering Graham standing over the man who started the whole thing at the expense of his ears and mental well-being. There remained a chance that Daniel didn't know who exactly put the man of that description in such a state, but I felt as though he mentioned me and the guard's commendable job beforehand in order to say he wasn't talking about me or my men's actions in the second riot. Lifelong damage for one mistake is a tragic thing. I hope the man recovers enough to take care of himself. If not, he might as well have just been killed," said Daniel, causing a lingering silence. I was aware of the condition of the waster Graham had punished over the course of those meetings about the incident. However, the topic was still a sore one amongst the guards when the members of the guards weren't celebrating the badassness of Graham's vicious display of mercy. After a moment, my younger kids were still distracted, but everyone else save for Graham was looking to Daniel when I said at length, "The situation was complicated, Daniel. In the end, the violence was stopped, and the community will ensure that man gets the help he needs." The missionary looked around the table, still not even appearing to notice Graham, and maybe he took my subdued reaction as a sign of agreement, since he then added in a nearly lecturing tone, "I know that's not the message we're sending to those who come to our gates. Don't start anything, or someone will batter you into oblivion and shoot your ears off. Still, I wonder what the refugees out there will take home with them. Another dead silence ensued as Daniel's gaze went around the table. I saw the eyes of my wife go to Daniel with an expression that said, "Let's not talk about this anymore. The children don't need to hear about that either." I was about to vocalize what my wife said with her face, but then I saw the wrapped head of Graham slowly turn to Daniel. When Daniel saw this, a brief look of shock appeared on his face when the words,
"If you have something to say to me, you should say it to me directly, Daniel,"
came slowly, sternly, and politely out from behind the bandages like verbal knives. Daniel's face colored. Hannah looked up from her comic below the table, and the eyes of everyone else went to Graham, not shocked, just taken aback by the thought of that statue finally speaking. The eyes of Graham were dull between the wrappings and locked onto the face of Daniel, who shifted in his chair uncomfortably to break the eye contact. Daniel's face colored further as the moment went on, and perhaps he felt he was caught in the act of something he felt he could get away with. Daniel straightened himself up further, collected his composure, and returned his gaze to Graham as he said, full of seemingly genuine remorse, "I'm sorry for not speaking about or to you directly, Mr. Graham." The wrapped statue nodded cordially in acknowledgement of the apology and a sign of forgiveness while the eyes remained on Daniel, incapable of showing almost any emotion despite the wrappings. At the gesture, Daniel added in a voice full of humility and serious resolution, "I truly am glad that you have returned to us, and more importantly, to Christ. I almost wept for joy when I received the letter speaking of your arrival." Graham's head lowered slightly, looking either ashamed or attempting to conceal some other emotion. And Daniel concluded his opinion on Graham's return with consideration of the past and thoughts of the future. "I'm just worried how things like that will reflect on how the tribes of the wilderness view us." He paused. "What I heard happened in the market, that was an injustice to you, no question. But what happened there also shows me that your past of war and all that is still close behind you. I don't think I'm alone in feeling that way. And I know things like that don't just disappear. They affect you, and they'll show even after you're born anew." Everyone at the table was silent for a long moment after that, and I think even the kids understood what Daniel laid forth. He was right, he wasn't alone in thinking that way. Graham's future in the community was still undecided, and it wasn't known what that future would look like. But no matter how Daniel, me, or any other new Canaanite felt about what happened in the market that day, they all felt. Even if they wouldn't admit it out loud, the conclusion I had arrived at, and the one Graham would speak after the silence ended. Graham raised his head back upright to meet the gaze of Daniel and said,
"But it's how the thing that follows me is used that defines me. As long as my eyes remain on him, I will remain a mere tool in what happens."
Chapter 17. Communion with Friends, Part 2. The evening went on, and shortly after Daniel and Graham's moment, my wife allowed the kids to be excused from the table. Hannah and Joseph left for their room, Joseph looping around the table just to have a reason to touch the burned man on the shoulder accidentally as he passed. I would have reprimanded the boy, but he was gone and annoying Hannah in the other room before I could say anything, and Graham appeared to not even notice despite his severely sensitive skin beneath the wrapping. Michelle followed her brother and sister into the other room to ensure they got changed over for bed, but returned shortly after since she considered herself already an adult. The tense little moment between Graham and Daniel regarding the dead horses tribe and the incident in the market seemed to allow Graham into more of the conversation. As the evening resumed, the conversations were taken from one to another, and Graham was still mostly silent, but much more involved than he had been. There was another tense moment when the conversation went into the kinds of threats in the wilderness to us and our allies. When that started, I began wishing that Michelle and even my wife had gone with the kids, since I was the one doing most of the talking, and preferred not to discuss details of my job when my family was around. Because of that, my wife and eldest daughter got a front row seat for the detailed version of what I told them happened on the expedition, where I brought back the outlaw Tom Cade. I gave this account with consideration to Graham, but Daniel and I got into a polite but heated moment after I gave my opinion about what should happen with Cade and how I felt the temple sect and elders would be too lenient in the end. Daniel especially got somewhat flustered when I said the elders didn't understand the reality of the dangers out in the wastes. I felt as though the elders were becoming increasingly appeasing with our enemies and trying to peacefully deal with especially violent enemies who didn't know what peace meant. Daniel reminded me of our obligation to follow what the word says, and spoke of times in the community's past where similar enemies had come around by those peaceful means I was denigrating. Daniel acknowledged my position, and argued against my view of the elders' policy of tolerance by pointing out other instances in recent years where they promoted force. It was hard for Daniel and I to agree on things like this, and not resort to statements like "you don't see the kinds of things the Guard does," because Daniel had in fact seen it all. That was actually one of the reasons I liked him so much. Similar to Mr. Mathers and I, Daniel had been all over the wilderness. Daniel had seen the kinds of violence and terror out there that makes men like me decide to join the Guard. But he saw that kind of thing, and decided he was willing to go out there armed with a Bible in one hand and sidearm in the other, rather than an automatic weapon in both hands, than a Bible in his pack. Mr. Mathers sat somewhere in the middle. Even though Mr. Mathers chose to follow the path into the temple sect, he remained one of the very select few in that part of the community to take more of the opinions of the Guards than those he served under. It still puzzled me how Daniel and the other career missionaries like him could see all manner of horrors out there and still believe that the elders weren't at least partially blinded by being safe in our town for so many years. At one point in our discussion, Daniel spoke to Mr. Mathers for backup on the point he was making, only to feel slightly betrayed when Mr. Mathers said he felt I was in the right. The elders' constant bickering was a problem, and although I agreed that the spiritually correct solution they landed on was best in particular cases, their policy did almost nothing to account for the moment and prevent things like the massacre at Dell Station in '71. He argued that their fighting wasn't the point, and that the spirit would act for the moment amongst those in the situation. After laying this out, Daniel was surprised when he got support from Graham, who'd been rather silent in this particular discussion. Strange as it was Graham who pointed out that the actions amongst those participating in the events of discussion usually ended up doing what the elders concluded was the best course of action. Then that raised my point again of, so what's the point of all the arguing between the elders? My wife and Michelle were about as lost as whoever might be reading this, but we all agreed to disagree before the conversation could go in another loop about the same things. After that, it was late, and I believe Michelle had mentally checked out. Being too exhausted from hearing so much about community direction and elder vision, she decided to stand up and clear the table. By this point in the evening, even my wife was propping her head on her hand, only sticking around out of a host's responsibility to see all the guests depart. The conversation was still winding down, and when Michelle was done clearing the table, she thanked Daniel one more time for such a lovely prayer before the dinner, then kissed her mom goodnight, and me as well, before she finally left for her room. Once Michelle had left, my poor wife shook herself awake and excused herself from the table, saying she would be back, but was just going to change over for bed. I felt as though the evening was about over as well, and was going to begin the conclusion of the evening with a customary yawn, and it's getting late, but this was wonderful. We should do it again soon, but that was prevented when the door to my wife and I's room shut. Mr. Mathers turned his head to Mr. Graham, asking something he clearly wanted to this whole night. "Mr. Graham, if you don't mind my asking, what do you know about the state of NCR these days?" The question was unexpected by everyone, Graham probably most of all. Still, the question was asked politely, and almost as if Mr. Mathers didn't even care about the answer. The head of Graham turned, and he scrutinized the face of the asker for a moment, perhaps wondering if the question was some kind of insult. I was the only one at the table who knew of Mr. Mathers' affiliation before he came to Christ, so even Daniel looked puzzled by the question. Graham saw the seriousness in the face of Mr. Mathers, understood it wasn't some kind of personal attack towards him, and after a moment said at length,
"I'm not entirely sure what you mean."
Mr. Mathers explained, partially subdued from realizing how the question may have sounded to a man who suffered his current state, partially due to NCR's victory over him. That realization still didn't stop him from asking what was on his mind, perhaps even for weeks, as he went on with a new hint of stern curiosity. "The dam, I mean." He paused, Graham stayed silent, and the deacon resumed. "I know you probably don't know anything about me, but I have a personal relationship with NCR, one that I still don't think I can escape despite being here for so many years. I just want to know, what kind of damage was done to them when you and the Legion?" He almost couldn't finish his question, the last word smothered in guilt for even asking. "Attacked The only sound was the muffled noise of the kids playing through their closed door and the sound of Michelle and my wife opening drawers to change for bed. Even Daniel sat there silent with a new look on his face as he faced Mr. Mathers, probably wondering why his friend in the temple sect asked the question he did. I was partially curious as well, though I knew it had to have stemmed from his prior affiliation with NCR. The eyes went to Graham again when he began speaking. Starting slowly, Graham said,
"There was much damage. Damage to my forces, and damage to NCR without question, not even counting the damage to my own self. I don't see how the particulars of the Battle of Hoover Dam that far south could be of interest to you or to New Canaan exactly. There isn't much that I know for certain about numbers and statistics. I was imprisoned nearly 4 months after the battle, and before being reduced to my current state. But if it helps satisfy your curiosity, I can only tell you I saw the corpse piles atop the dam as I waited for Caesar's arrival. I saw the smoke of the battle as it happened, the bodies falling, and the road across the dam painted red by the blood of so many killed men. I waited and waited, and the bodies were stacked when NCR moved back in to occupy the bridge over the Colorado. The stacks of Legion Red and NCR Brown appeared equally high, but maybe more in number on the red side, hundreds on both sides. In the end, the specifics don't matter when the result was the same. NCR reoccupied the dam, and I got what was already a long time coming."
Graham paused, then after another moment asked,
"Does that satisfy?"
The deacon looked away and thought for a while as Daniel and I stayed quiet. Mr. Mathers took all that in and began to slowly nod his head as he stared at the table's centerpiece, before saying in that almost embarrassed tone, "Yes, it does. Thanks for that, Mr. Graham." Mr. Graham sat motionless and staring at the deacon, looking like he was still trying to discern the motive of the original question. At last, the burned man nodded, like he'd done at Daniel's embarrassment earlier, and the deacon had recovered himself enough to speak again. He looked to all of us, including Graham, as he sought to explain himself a little better. I'm only interested because I follow what happens amongst the missionaries, scouts, and New Canaan protected caravans in the far western wilderness." I knew this to be true, and I believe Daniel did as well, even if Graham was still ignorant. I also knew that he left out the part where he would have explained his interest also included how many of his former brothers in the Rangers he could pray for. I believe he would have mentioned that if he were in perhaps different company. Either way, Mr. Mathers went on, I've also heard in rumor and seen in reports that NCR Rangers have been clearing out of the region for months. Word has it they're getting called away from the southwestern parts of Utah, where those groups I mentioned typically go to. I wonder what that means for the tribes out there, since the war between the Whitelegs and 80s is heating up down that way. NCR prospectors and many rangers are no real friends of the tribes we work with down south, and I don't know what the situation will look like if NCR is consolidating further south in the Mojave.
"Most likely,"
said Graham flatly before elaborating on his response.
"I can almost assure you that NCR is vacating from the southwest Utah area thanks to me."
I wasn't blaming you, said Mr. Mathers, not quite hearing the emotionless or non-accusatory tone Graham was speaking in. Graham went right along.
"I understand. But yes, it's because of me. I know not how close a friend NCR has been with New Canaan, or the tribes of that region bordering the Mojave in recent years. But I've already spoken to Constable Hanshaw and told him that I fully intend to assist in any part of the wilderness that may have been affected, directly by my actions with the Legion."
All at once, everyone at the table's eyes grew wide as we all asked, "What?" in near unison. Graham froze, and I believe he would have raised his eyebrows if they were still around or weren't covered by the bandages. After a short moment, I asked the man calmly and coolly, "What does that mean? Are you going to be working for the Guard?" Daniel and Mr. Mathers were nodding their heads like they too were deathly curious about the answer. Graham looked to all of us and resumed slowly, without change in pitch or tone.
"Perhaps in time. It was pretty clear that the constable and the elders want me to stay concealed in town for a long time. There is understandably still great fear about who will come looking for me in the coming weeks or months. But eventually, God willing, there will come a time when I'm able to return what you and New Canaan have already done for me. I don't know what that looks like yet, or when that will be, but I know that God saved me for a reason, and I owe it to him and all of you to act upon that reason, since I can't imagine it being anything other than the opportunity to rectify the sins of my past. If my presence here is putting the community in any danger, the constable says I have a duty to help defend it. and that something within my soul that followed me out of the canyon says I have the ability.
Graham's head turned to Daniel at that last part. The room sat silent a few seconds, and the sound of my bedroom door interrupted the silence as my wife returned to us in her sleepwear. She took her place at the table, read the strange silence amongst us men, and joined in the silence before Graham's head turned back to me.
But first things first, I'm told I must wait for some quarters to be arranged for me somewhere in town.
Turning to my wife.
And thank you for taking me in, ma'am. I'll try to be as convenient a guest as possible.
For the first time since his arrival in our home that afternoon, my wife smiled genuinely at Mr. Graham, and I was left with a lot to think about. For whatever reason, it had just occurred to me in that moment that this man was here to stay with us, in our house. Daniel and Mr. Mathers stood with yawns, looked at the clock above the hallway, and saw how late it was. They gave their farewells. Me, my wife, and Mr. Graham stood as well, and my wife and I embraced the men, giving the customary, "We'll do this again soon," and walked them out, while I took a long look at the small stack of sheets and blankets atop the couch where Graham was going to sleep. I respected Graham, but I still didn't quite know what I thought of his display in the market that granted him entry into New Canaan proper, and I thought of everything that was said over dinner. I wondered how Daniel took his meeting with the man he'd only heard about in letters and stories throughout his youth. I wondered what exactly Mr. Mathers was worried or thinking about at news of his former brothers in the Rangers getting pulled out of the Utah wilderness to fight a war in the Mojave. The relationship between Graham and the two men of the Temple sect would be brought up again. But they both had opinions and prejudices when it came to our returned brother. One of the men even had a direct interaction with the same man before his literal baptism by fire. But more on that later. For now, though, the evening was over. Only a few people in New Canaan had even heard about the elders' decision to bring Joshua Graham inside the walls of their home. And what he would do within the community was still uncertain, while his future role was at least alluded to this night. Still, it was time for bed. My friends in the Temple sect were on their way to their respective domiciles under the street lamps. I was in bed with my wife, and the one-time most dangerous man in all of the Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah wastelands was laying my guest sheets out on my couch. Chapter 18. A Child's Innocence. For me, the next morning would be just like the normal routine. I'd awake early, help my wife get the kids fed, and help her clean them up before the clock turned 5:40. I'd set out to the guard barracks, conduct my usual role at the morning muster, deliver any news of the day, and set off with my men to man our posts for the day. Lately, it had been mostly gate stations and market patrols or assignment to the watchtowers, but part of our shifts on the ground level was dedicated to protecting the charity stations. The constable had learned from the incident with Graham, and so an extra layer of protection was added around our charity workers since the refugee situation was still so chaotic. A few days later, Mr. Mathers' construction project would be completed, and the refugees would be sent there to have their needs met or persons tended to. Because of this, and because of the nature of my job, I didn't have a whole lot to say about what it was like to live with Joshua Graham on my couch. When word eventually got out about what the elders decided to do with Graham, it wasn't long before the question was asked, well, where's he staying in the meantime? I don't think it's outside the realm of probability that it was likely Hanshaw's personal runner contingent that started to tell people where they were tasked with taking the burned man's possessions after he was released from the cell. After that, it may not be any surprise that the guardsmen of my detachment and others were constantly hounding me about what it was like to live with him. For reasons I just told, I didn't have much to say. This left the guardsmen I worked beside to speculate. It was actually so irritating, Nathan in particular, that I decided it was about time I checked in with the other half of my detachment for a few days. Unfortunately, the men under my other squad leader, Chance Rhines, were little better than the ones under John Langdon, the reader is more familiar with. Not only were the men under Rhines just as interested in Graham as the men of my other squad, but I hadn't spent enough time with them in the past month to keep afloat in their flood of other questions for me. Still, getting some time with them was long overdue, and although I would return to the company of Langdon's squad a week or two after Graham had moved out, it was a long couple days as the memory of Graham's incident in the market was still very fresh amongst everyone in the guard. Some of my brothers and sisters in the community would later tell me how they thought it odd to hear that Graham was staying with me and my family. Most of them were more focused on how unorthodox it was to leave a man at home alone with another man's wife. Not that people were speculating about affairs and the like, it was just a custom of our community to never have a man alone under the same roof as 1, 2, or even 3 women of the community, unless he was related to them. I found it odd that their fixation was on that for the most part, and not the fact of who he once was, or why he was brought into the community proper. He was only our guest for about 4 days, but from everything I heard from my wife, she was almost never there during the day. Apparently, he wasn't either. I mentioned previously that my wife was, for the most part, a housewife. However, being a housewife in the community rarely meant being at home. In order to run a household, she was taken all over town, going to fetch water, food for meals, buying and selling clothes, tools, and goods for the house. She retrieved the kids once school let out, helped them with their school work, escorted them to their activities or children's groups, took them shopping for things they needed, etc. None of this is even mentioning the amount of volunteer work she did for missions coordination, the sewing she did with her women's group, charity assignment, the evening support and Bible studies on certain days, etc. The point being that she was a busy woman, and even when she was home, she was cleaning, doing laundry, preparing meals, tending the garden, or preparing to run one of her errands. In the end, I too was curious about what our house guest was like that first evening, but after being reminded of all she had to do, she told me that she didn't even believe he was home. My wife mentioned how Mr. Graham had left maybe 30 minutes after I did, and only saw him around noon before she caught sight of him entering the house, while she was tending our garden in the back, only for him to leave out the front again a moment later. He was there for dinner and remained very silent when he wasn't answering Joseph, and later Hannah's barrage of questions. It was like that every day he was with us. Every morning I saw Graham asleep on the couch when my wife and I made breakfast for the kids. He joined us at the table each time, sometimes eating his own food. Then, I'd see him in the evening when I returned from the shift. I got to see him Saturday for a little longer since Saturday was the Sabbath for our detachment, but I was kept busy with the Guard's Bible studies in the evening and time with my wife during the day. Graham was essentially a mystery the whole time he lived with us, and why he left or what he did during the days was a mystery to me, my wife, and pretty much everyone who knew of the short-term housing arrangement. That was except for one person. The person who knew more about our guests' first days in the community and time spent living with us was actually my son Joseph. I learned all of this sometime later, but my 7-year-old son was given an assignment by his teacher the day before Mr. Graham showed up at our house to keep a diary for 5 days. The goal of the assignment was pretty standard. Every child of the community learned to read and write at a young age, and this particular exercise was given with the reasoning that kids should know how to keep journals. This was important, even at a young age, because every trade or position in the community was required to keep them or make logs no matter the station. Whether that child would grow up and become a career missionary, a member of the Guard, or even a barber or bishop, journals were a very regular part of our community, and largely how our history was kept so well in places like the archives. Of course, lessons like these would continue, and even Michelle would keep similar ones in mission prep school even during this time. But Joseph's teacher gave his class this assignment with instruction to write about whatever they did or whatever they felt like writing about for those 5 days. Grammar and spelling was lenient because he and his classmates were 7 at the time, but it was because of my son and his parents' guest that me, my wife, and his teacher got a very unique perspective on this short period in Joshua Graham's life. With only minimal editing in order to compensate for a 7-year-old's spelling, poor handwriting, and grammatical choices, I think it's best to describe this whole thing in my son Joseph's own words, given what I could decipher. Joseph's homework. November 15th, 2277. Today was dumb, but tonight was really fun. I hated how I have to write for Mrs. Pryor's class. I told her yesterday that I didn't know what to write about when she told me our homework. Ronnie and Caleb and Tom made fun of me on the way home, and I told them they were mad because they didn't know what to write about too. I was sad and even sadder because they got their journals first, and so I had to get the pink one. Debbie and Rose made fun of me for that too, but it was better when Michelle walked me the rest of the way home. I asked her why Mom wasn't picking me up, and I didn't feel better when we got Hannah too. But it was better when Michelle said I can have one of her books so that Caleb won't make fun of me for the pink one anymore. Then I asked if Michelle can ask Mom if I can walk home with Ronnie and Caleb tomorrow, and she said she would, because whenever I ask they say no, and Mom always listens to Michelle. That made me feel better, but I was still sad, and I felt better when I got home because I know what to write about. Dad came home from work early with a friend, and he was going to make Ronnie and Caleb sad because he got to come to my family instead of Ronnie or Caleb's. Dad said that Mr. Joshua Graham was going to stay with us for days, and that was so cool. He had dinner with my family, and Dad was quiet, but me and Hannah had fun. Mr. Mathers and Mr. Daniel was there too, and Mr. Graham said I can call him Joshua, and the dinner was fun. Michelle was really weird and had that face she made when she talks to Isaiah or Evan when Evan was around. Girls are weird, but Joshua was quiet, and he sounded like he hurt when he eats, but he told me that I'm faster than Caleb when I showed him how fast I can run, and said at dinner that we can be best friends when he's feeling better. Ronnie will be mad that I'm friends with Joshua first, and that he stayed at our house and not his when I tell him tomorrow. Mr. Graham never made a promise to be best friends with Joseph at the dinner table, nor agreed that Joseph was faster at running than Caleb. Some of this is merely Joseph's imaginings, although I have no way of verifying what he describes of the next days, since I was busy with my duties. November 16th. Today I woke up Dad and Mom first because I couldn't sleep. Hannah couldn't too, and I wanted to see Joshua. Dad and Mom left him to sleep on the couch as they made breakfast, and I got to watch him. It looked like it hurt even when he slept, and I dared Hannah to look under his bandage while he sleeps. She didn't want to and ran away, and I looked at him and his eyes were open, and I can't tell if he could see me next to him, so I asked him. He said he could, and I asked him if he was always going to be like this. He asked what time it was, and I told him it was almost breakfast time, and he didn't say anything else until I asked if what Ronnie and Debbie said about him was true. He didn't know what I meant, and I asked if he shot a man in the market, and he said yes, but I don't want to tell Ronnie that he didn't shoot the bandit dead because I don't want to give Ronnie 2 chocolates. I asked if he was going to go with my dad to the Guard today because I think he will be good at it, and he said no, but can't tell what he's going to do today. I said he should go Temple because he liked it so much the last time, and he remembered I went with him that one night. Then Dad and Mom came in the room and told me to stop bothering Joshua. I wasn't bothering him, and he said so too, but I was hungry and went to the table to eat. At school we worked on our diaries and learned more math after lunch. I don't like school because it makes me feel dumb, but Mrs. Pryor and Mom and Michelle say I'm good at it, but Hannah always calls me dumb. School was bad, and I was mad because of math, but I remembered Michelle told Mom that I can walk home today, and Ronnie and Caleb couldn't make fun of me anymore because I don't have a pink diary anymore, and they were mad because I told them about Joshua staying with us and how much friends we are. After school was over at 2:30, Caleb and Ronnie asked me all about Joshua, and I couldn't think of any more to make up, so Caleb asked if we could follow him. I would get in trouble for not coming home, but Mom knows I have kids group at 5, and I can say that I stayed at Ronnie's to work on homework, so we went. None of us knew where Graham was, but I thought he would be at home when we saw him walk past the community garden by the school in Town Square. He was going to the trades by the north side, and we went to follow him. I could prove I would be a better spy than Caleb. We followed him 2 streets, till he entered the goods store, and we hid in the alley, and I don't think he saw us. He left going to East Side, and there was no one else around, so Ronnie kept watch when Caleb and me went in the store. I asked Mr. Eastman what Joshua bought, and he said he bought 2 strips of jerky and a bottle of water and 3 chocolates for us. I hit Caleb because I knew it was his sneeze that gave us away, and he wanted to hit me back but was happy about the chocolate. We tried to sneak after him again, and I think we were better this time because he didn't say anything when we followed him to the North End workstation where he made ammo by himself for 30 minutes. He left something in the collection bucket and then went to a community fire to toast meat and stitch hides for another 30 minutes. Once he was done, he didn't see us when we followed him more. Now there were people leaving their jobs, and the streets were busy, but everyone pretended like he wasn't there, but he didn't seem to mind. We wanted to see where he went before we had to go to kids group, so we followed him to the square, and he went up to the temple but didn't go inside because he went around side and opened the gate to the prayer garden. We didn't know why he was there, so we looked over the wall and he was reading the Bible on a bench in a group of the trees. Ronnie and Caleb and me decided to go here tomorrow, and we went to the kids group to play games and learn about David. When I was at home, Mom was mad at me for not coming home after school, but she was nice again when I told her again what Michelle said, and I asked if I could spend time with my friends after school again, and she said yes if I do my homework. Then I saw him at dinner, and I thanked him for the candy, and he ate his own food at the table with me, Michelle, Hannah, Mom, and Dad. Then I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep, and I forgot to make my diary, so I did that, and was done before I was too tired. Joseph clearly liked writing, but it was evident just from this entry that he only really liked writing about what he was interested in. There was much I had to do editing-wise just to make the above legible and make sense since he was 7 at the time, but the kid impressed me. Even more interesting was the subject matter, since with it I got to get an insight into the character of Joshua beyond the events I witnessed and beyond his reputation. In the next entry, Joseph woke Mr. Graham up in a way almost identical to the way he did in the previous entry, and then spent a lot more time talking about how much he hated his morning baths on these days, and what happened at school than he did previously. After this, his journal starts when he and his friends decided they'd seek out Graham again. November 16. Many words about waking up Graham, how much he hates baths outside, speculation about why his mom gets frustrated with him on bath days, everything that happened at school, etc. Ronnie and me saw Joshua make more ammo after school and help Mr. Vickers with the wood he was cutting. I think he was going to the fire again when he was done, so me and Ronnie and Caleb went to the prayer garden to wait in the bushes for him to see what he was doing. I like the prayer garden even if it is boring if I am in it too long. It's really pretty though. I like all the plants since there aren't many green or flowers plants anywhere else in town. I also like reading all the prayers pinned to the cross in the middle of the garden, and I sometimes think to pray for them too when I pray before bed, but sometimes I forget. Me and Caleb and Ronnie hid in the bushes behind the bench he was sitting yesterday, and we got real quiet when we saw him come through the gate. He didn't see us, and we were quiet as a mouse, and we watched him write on a paper, then pin the paper to the cross, then sit on the bench and open his Bible. I was scared because he was so close, and Caleb wished he brought his jacket because it was cold, but he was quiet because he didn't want to be seen. I was scared too, and Joshua read on that bench for a long time before he said loudly, "I know you've been watching me. You can come out, boys." I hit Ronnie because I know it was him who made a sound, but he was too stiff and we came out. Joshua knew me and we stood in front of him. Caleb and Ronnie said sorry, but Joshua looked nice and closed his Bible and asked if we wanted to talk to him. I said yes, and Ronnie and Caleb were still sad. I asked him why he was making ammo, and he said he wanted to hunt later, or trade. Then I asked him if he was feeling better, and he said he was getting used to the pain. Then Caleb asked what Joshua was reading, and he said he was reading from Acts when Saul became Paul. I didn't know Acts too good, and he said he would answer questions, but Ronnie asked him if his dad was right, when his dad said he used to be a very evil man. Ronnie's question looked like it made him sad, and I hit him, and Joshua said not to do that, and I said sorry. I asked if that was why my dad didn't talk about him, and if that is why people avoid him in the street, and he said it was, but he's trying to be better. He said only time, and God will fix that, and Caleb said his dad talks about him all the time. Caleb's dad is my dad's guard friend, and I like Mr. Langdon, but I told Joshua that my dad's cooler than Caleb's dad because my dad is his dad's boss. It goes on like this for a while. The boys ask Mr. Graham all manner of questions, occasionally going off on tangents because of their own boyhood minds. It really was something else to read this later and see how much interest and kindness they had in a man who had been a topic of taboo at their family's dinner tables for so many years until a few short weeks ago. While their parents avoided him or busied themselves with their daily lives, it was nice to hear that these kids had such an innocent curiosity about him as word gradually spread that he was here to stay, and within the walls. The entire entry ended without much else when Joseph writes, "Then it was late and Mom and Dad were going to be mad at me for being late, and Caleb and Ronnie were going to get in trouble too because there was no kids group tonight. Joshua said he would walk us home, and Ronnie's parents were glad he was okay, but he got in trouble because he was home so late, but thanked Joshua for taking him home. Caleb's dad was okay because he was off when my dad was, and shake Joshua's hand, and Joshua took me home too in time for dinner." There were 2 more entries, but the Saturday with my wife was spent shopping with her, relaxing in the East End's community garden, and we even spent a few hours at the library before going to our groups for the evening. It wasn't the most romantic day, but we got some stuff done. My wife learned some new recipes for the house, and I brushed up on my knowledge of spirit and self before finishing off the night with one of the Guard's study groups. Michelle and Hannah said that Graham was hardly there that Saturday, but the boy didn't have much to write about other than the ways that he tormented his sisters while my wife and I were out. Although in the entry for that Saturday, he did say he assumed Joshua was going about his strange business across town and hounded his sisters to stalk the man with him to little avail. Joseph went to an all-Sunday event with his class and kids group that Sunday and talked about that in his diary, but there was something I noticed throughout Sunday that I couldn't quite place until I read Joseph's entries. The Friday that Graham escorted Joseph and his friends home was the night I noticed our house guest take on a new tone. He still remained largely silent, and a man of few words in the mornings or at the table. But over those nights, he became much more alive. He wouldn't be accepted wholly by the community for still a while yet, but the sounds of laughter and amount he talked to us only increased if ever so slightly, and no matter how painful it was for him. Mr. Graham's incident in the market was still something only the members of the Guard and the Temple really knew about beyond rumor, but perhaps that was best. What he had done and what he had contained inside of him seemed to matter little when he was enjoying dinner at our table, exciting the children, and only spoke in the politest of words. It came as something of a shock when I got off my shift that Sunday, returned home when my family was still with their groups, and saw the note on the folded-up stack of bedding atop my couch saying, "Thank you for you and your family's acceptance of me into your home. I hope I was not too much of a burden, and I look forward to seeing you all again real soon. If needed, you can find me at my new dwelling the elders assigned for me. Northwest Quadrant, QD, Common Housing, Building BLDG, 2, Unit 8. I knew the place. It was an old single-story motel restored over the years only a stone's throw from the North Fields and on the opposite side of the town from the barracks. Almost a 20-minute walk straight north from my home. It was a building for unmarried men of the new Canaan population. I knew they weren't the nicest dwellings, but it was nicer than the shack he was living in outside the walls. The common houses like that for men or women were typically considered more like temporary housings for those who were going to get married or were preparing to take lodging with a trade like the Guard or Temple that had their own housing groups. Still, perhaps it was best that he was going to be amongst the ranks of the general unmarried population, but it got me thinking, what is his permanent place in the community going to look like, and when will that be?